Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third in the joint STEPTO CCSI speaker series on perennial issues in the relation between international extractive industry investors and host states. I'm Christoph Bondi from STEPTO Partners STEPTO, and be co-hosting this with Lisa Sachs, the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And we're delighted to be launching into this third in this series. The first two addressing issues relating to the balance between regulatory flexibility and regulatory stability, and the next about the appropriate benefits to be drawn from the project for both participants, private participants and governments. And this third one addressing a really interesting and crucial issue about relations with local communities. So often when one thinks about what is the kind of impact of a new extractive project on a host country, obviously the most immediate impact is going to be on that host community, and that relationship becomes a crucial part in the long-term viability of the project and of the benefits that might flow from the project to the local community and indeed to the investor. And it can be a very difficult balance, and as we'll see in the discussion today, because if a discussion is held, say, with the central government and not with the local community, there can be tensions that flow from, well, who is this project really going to benefit from? And the issue of what is going to be left after the project closes down. What are the long-term benefits from the project? We're really fortunate today to have a very distinguished panel of people who have a lot of experience on the ground dealing with these issues. Starting off with Kelly Stark Anderson, who's the Executive Vice President, Corporate Affairs and General Counsel at Dundee Precious Metals. Dundee Precious Metals is looking after projects right now in Bulgaria, in Serbia, in Ecuador, and has been in Namibia. So a lot of experience in diverse areas, managing this relationship with local communities. Todd Cluett is an external affairs executive who has a lot of experience working with in-house as a counsel in extractive industries, especially in places like Panama. So going to bring a lot of his own perspective, but he's now kind of stepped away and is providing more strategic advice, and that will really enrich the discussion. Gitta Rowlands is the head of multinational enterprises and responsible business conduct at the International Labour Organization. So she'll bring a very important perspective on what kind of international standards can be brought into this effort to ensure that there is benefit to the local community. And finally, Alan Marks, who's a senior fellow of CCSI, and he brings years of transactional experience in the resource development sector and is now a strategic consultant in this sector. So I'm really, we've had a really interesting preparatory discussion for this session, and I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow, and I hope everyone enjoys it. As with the previous sessions, you can ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our level best to integrate them or seek to respond to them in follow-up. Lisa?
Thank you so much. And yes, thanks to this extraordinary group. I'm really excited for this discussion. Just to underscore what Christoph said, this is the third in a series that is really grounded in a shared recognition that despite decades of effort through principles and toolkits and technical support and frameworks and actually robust efforts by the mining sector too, by companies, that many of the purported benefits to local communities, to host governments, many of the promises about environmental conservation and preservation have remained elusive, or at least fallen short of expectations. And particularly in light of the renewed attention to the mining sector, in light of the surge in demand for minerals for the energy transition and for all components of for digitalization and the transportation sector and so on, it seemed incredibly important to take stock of why the benefits have been so elusive, what remains so challenging, about the sector and how we can do better going forward. So today, I would say that we're focusing on probably one of the most politically and emotionally charged issues in the mining sector, which is the management of environmental and community impacts. One of the things that has come up in past sessions is just a recognition of the basic fact that while mining operations are physically located in communities, that the decisions shaping them are often made far from these affected communities. And while the benefits accrue either to the central government or to the sectors around the world that benefit from the minerals, it's the local communities and the local environment that bear the brunt of the impacts. An important thing to start with, I think, and then I will immediately turn to the panel, is that the historical track record on these particular issues has been particularly problematic in the sector. There is a track record jointly or by activities from both governments and companies of social conflict and disruption, of environmental devastation, and so on. And all of that has led to serious distrust about the impacts, the local impacts of the mining sector. So that's where we're starting from today. And what I hope that we can address is why it's been so challenging and what we can do going forward. The first question I just want to put to the panel is actually a follow-up from a question that I asked at the last session, which is that I am struggling to identify communities that are substantially better off for after a mining project, despite the promises for decades. And I'm wondering, just as a starting point, so that we can either have a shared assessment of what good looks like or a baseline recognition that it has indeed been challenging. If any of the panelists have can point to or can help us identify communities that have been left substantially better off from a mining project, and maybe you want to open that up, and then we'll go to more substantive questions from each of the panelists. Kelly, I see that you unmuted.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. And the first is that, you know, the disasters and the terrible outcomes that there certainly have been, tailings dam failures, fatalities, human rights abuses, are well documented. We know that they happen. We grieve when they happen. But what the mining industry is actually not very good at is speaking about where things have gone well, the successes. And there is a little bit of a tendency, I think, generally to view it, you know, through, you know, gray lenses, shall we say. And I'm not advocating that we put on rose-colored spectacles at all. I think that taking the cover off, making sure we fully, honestly, and deeply understand what we're doing wrong, but acknowledging that there are things that we are doing right more and more and more. So I'd like to put that as part of the context of the conversation. Certainly my experience at DPM is that we do have success stories. We have two operations, two producing mines in Bulgaria. The first that has been in operation for decades, that we purchased early in the 2000s in Chelopech, very undercapitalized, a community that was very poor, that we invested very heavily in. And now Chelopech has the highest average salary in the whole of Bulgaria. So I think that's a success. Our Ada Tepe mine in Krumovgrad, which is a short-lived mine, came into production in 2019, will close next year. But from the inception of the construction in 2017 through to a couple of years ago when it was last measured, the fastest growing municipality in average per capita income in Bulgaria at an 89% increase. The mayor in that town, who was initially very opposed to the mine, was one of the keynote speakers at the opening, saying it brought people home. We have created small, medium enterprise programs in the area and translating them into where we have projects where we partner with the local bank to fund projects and enterprises that are not mining related at all. So there's, small agricultural projects, other types of enterprises. Beneficiaries receive funding from the local bank in terms of a loan. We match with a grant. An example, we financed 69 projects in Krumavgrad, creating 150 jobs for $5 million recently. Krumavgrad's population is 20,000 people. The mine's going to close next year. We're working with the municipality. We're hosting regular town halls to talk to the local area about what would they like to see happen afterwards. What can the site be used for? We will, of course, be there for a number of years post-closing. I can't tell you what it is going to end up looking like, but I can tell you we're investing in building a lot of trust to help move that community forward after we're gone.
That's great, Kelly. One thing that just strikes me from that, which is helpful, is what the measure is of impact, and whether the measure is income or broader development objectives. This is one of the things that we've been thinking about for years, is how do you measure improved outcomes in a community? But maybe in the spirit of really trying to reflect critically on the past trajectory, I'm intrigued by your saying that the mining sector doesn't communicate successes, because I actually see a bit the opposite, which is that a lot of mining companies are very proud of the programs that they have developed, but that in reality, when you look at the lasting impacts in the community, particularly looking at broader sustainable development outcomes, the successes that fall short of even the extremely good intentions of the mining companies. So maybe just to ask you one follow-up before going to others is what in terms of the programs that you're describing, what do you think have been the real reflections, either in your particular case or of the sector more generally, in grappling with what with the fact that, generally speaking, the outcomes have been much more sober in most mining communities around the world?
I can't speak for Dundee in particular in that sense, because generally I think we take a different approach. When I look at the sector, my feeling is that there is the lack of understanding of what the priorities are for the local communities, for the regional and national governments, and coming in actually with an attitude of, here's what I can do for you, rather than asking, what do they want? So I think the conversation needs to go in a different direction.
And Lisa, I think that links through with your question you were thinking about for Kelly before, which was about, how can things be done differently? And I think that perhaps can jump into to Kelly's response on that particular point. The point about not just saying, here's things we can do for you, but what would you like us to do, or what do you need, kind of thing.
Yeah, and actually, so I think Kelly speaking to what the new programs are is really helpful in that respect. And I think this point about trying to understand what the community wants. Actually, I would love to put that question to Todd a bit, with your experiences working in quite difficult contexts, not only Panama, but Mongolia and other complicated contexts. And I wonder if you can speak to your experience of whether the approach has been to understand, manage, and try to meet the expectations of the community, and really trying to exactly this, understand what the community wants, and the point is just to meet those expectations, or did you define positive outcomes in a more objective sense around certain types of development indicators or otherwise? I'm wondering if you can speak to how what you considered success, and what approach you took in the context in which you worked.
Sure. So I think, but can I answer sort of the first question, then get to that question, which is sort of your first question, Lisa, is, are communities better off? And if I think I've spent a lot of time in local communities in Mongolia, in Papua New Guinea, in Panama, and I think the answer is, well, it depends. And it probably depends on how you measure, which is to your second question. So in all of those places, little towns that are, hugely affected by large long-term mines. What you can see is improvements in like access to electricity, power, access to healthcare, access to education, access to employment in all of those places. But it's not, not everybody gets the same access, and it's not what people, it's rarely what the communities expected. So even if we've got power in, I remember the day the power got brought to the communities near the mine in Panama, everybody's happy about that. But it's a user pays system, and not everybody was able to access it. And equally, same for employment. While there was focus on employment at the mine for local communities, most times they didn't have the skill sets to do the jobs that was required. So there's resentment built up by those who don't get, whether it be access to, electricity, education, employment. And so there's sort of internal tensions within communities about who benefits and who doesn't. And that's when the mine's operating, right? So that's when the mine's earning money. And I think to Christoph's point at the outset, it's even harder once the mine shuts because there's no new money coming in. The income to sustain these benefits declines dramatically, and then it goes. Then the communities feel even more aggrieved because the level of access to the services has declined. And so I think there's a sort of a point about, and I think it was raised before, that part of this is about the expectation about what a mining company can provide and what it can't. And we shouldn't be in the business of saying, we should be in the business of limiting what a mining company can deliver and limiting the expectations. But all the incentives when you're seeking an approval for a mine are to promise the world. But it's not possible. It's not possible through the course of the mine. It's not possible at the end of the mine. So to your question, Lisa, what's the approach, what the approach of my team's taken in terms of development outcomes? I think the answer is a bit of a mix. So I think you always feel an obligation to comply with the conditions of consent of the ESHAs, right? And so in some instances, I've been at mines where those conditions of consent are fresh and they're meaningful to communities. But in Papua New Guinea, the conditions of consent were 20 years old. They weren't so meaningful. So then over time, you start to look at, in the different context, you look at what's the community wanting here? What gives you, that ephemeral license to operate? And that will drive where you put your efforts. So I think it changes over time how you approach these types of things.
That's incredibly helpful. And maybe Todd, just two follow-up questions if you have quick thoughts, otherwise we can come back to them and nothing is quick about these things. But two thoughts based on what you said. One is if I understand correctly, it sounds like you said that there's a tendency to overpromise what the mining company can do. But to some extent, that narrative is not just it's because it's in recognition of the need actually to show that there are going to be benefits, because that's an important reason for a community to take on the impact or to accept the impact that's going to have. So it seems like not overpromising in a sense means telling the community, yeah, there are going to be more impacts than benefits. And is that the right approach? And then my second question, just as a follow-up, is in terms of really understanding what the community wants, it makes me think of your first point that there are differential benefits to those in the community. And for sure, one of the biggest challenges in these contexts is who speaks and who negotiates on behalf of the community. So if there's no objective standard for what good looks like, then what isn't, or is there a risk, or how do you manage the risk that those who speak on behalf of the community in terms of the benefits that they want are not representative of the experience of the broader community?
So the second question is a really good one. And, the skills of the community folks in mining companies, ones that I've dealt with, are very, very good at being able to understand who in communities who's got formal authority, who's got informal authority, and genuinely understanding. And the question is sort of not just what do you want, but what do you need? What could we provide? And what's the compromise? And so that effort of understanding who represents the community is ongoing. It will change. It could change every few months, every few years. Certainly, I know folks in like African communities where the chiefs do not talk for the population. They talk for the groups who benefit from the chiefs' patronage. And so you've got to find ways of listening to and responding to those who don't have formal power, who've got informal authority in the place. And that's the skill set of the community, the social performance folks. And my experience in mining is there's a sort of a group of folks who are like professional at that stuff. And it's a really, really important skill to have. And I think they're increasingly good at understanding that sort of, that set of questions. What do you want? What do you need? What could we provide? What could the government provide? What's realistic here? Because the last thing you want to do is just come in, talk to the person who's got the formal authority, in Panama, the local mayor, the worst person to talk to on these things, and then just respond to what it's always a he, says he wants. So there's a lot to unpack at the local level around that stuff. To your second question, and I'll be quick. I think there's got to be some honesty. I think, as a general rule, honesty is the best policy on all of these things. Sounds trite, but it's true. The truth of it is, if I think of Mongolia, the Rio Tinto mine in Mongolia, when I was there, was going to provide about 30% of the nation's GDP, right? And so we had to share the benefits of that mine with the country, because the country had an expectation that it would see the benefits. So the country received the benefits, and what was left over, and the people who give you the formal approval are the national government, and what's left over in terms of benefits provided to the local communities. So in terms of physical impact, the local community bears 100%, but they might only get 20% of the benefits. So that's an imbalance. That's just a fact.
Todd, I think that's very helpful, because that honest fact, I think, underpins so much of the challenge, in fact, because that is, I think, what we see, which is that the benefits are mainly negotiated by a capital, and the impacts mostly felt by the communities. And this goes to a question that I was hoping to ask Geeta, but I think it's relevant for everyone, which is that when the expectation is arguably reasonably that the central government will use the revenues to invest in the public goods in the community and will extend education systems, health outcomes, infrastructure, transport, water and sewage, ICT infrastructure to the community, but then they don't. I think one of the things that we often hear from the sector reasonably is, this is not our job, which it's not. It should be the central government, but in the end, the communities don't benefit. So I guess I wonder, Geeta, from your if you can maybe speak to that, which is that if the companies recognize that so much of the success of so much of the impact and the potential positive impacts at the community level depend on the government and government capacity to extend public services and the political will to do that. Have you seen examples in which companies have tried meaningfully to engage with the ways that governments work and with the real either constraints or lack of either real lack of capacity to extend those services or a lack of political will, so that the company becomes a partner actually in ensuring that the public services reach the communities?
Thanks a lot, Lisa, for this question. And first of all, also thank you for inviting the ILO, in this discussion. And maybe we are a little bit different from the other speakers because, of course, I mean, we are an international organization. We are a specialized agency of the UN, But in a way, we are quite special because we are tripartite. So, we have among our members the governments, but also employers, organizations, and trade unions. So that makes us a little bit special even within the UN system. And of course, we are there to promote international labor standards, but also looking more broadly at employment creation, skills development, social protection. And everything that we do is actually based on social dialogue. And I think, the social dialogue element or broader consultations in a way is a little bit in the DNA of the ILO. And of course, we also as officials is something that we almost do, I would say, on a daily basis. And a lot of what we see happening, and I can, go a little bit more into the opportunities actually that critical minerals should be bringing, although I think that might have been covered in the previous sessions. But when you look at just the name of critical minerals. I mean, when you see they are critical minerals, why are they called critical minerals? First of all, because they are critical for the energy transition. That is one part, but at the same time, they are actually critical for development in many of these resource-rich countries. So I know we are talking a lot about, the legacy of the mining sector and so on, but I think it's really a time also to start thinking how it should be different in terms of the increased mining activities that are needed to just secure this energy transition and even digital transition and other transitions for which more minerals will be needed. And of course, they will come at the one hand from new mining projects, large formal mining projects that are often happening, of course, I mean, in mineral-rich countries, but where we know many of them are countries, they may be LDC countries, they may be countries with weak governance, weak capacity, countries with a high percentage of informality. So that is one thing. It will also ask for an increase of artisanal and small-scale mining, which is still, a different kind of issue where we see other problems happening, of course. And what we see is, at the one hand, there are high expectations indeed from the government that these, I would say, increased demand, of course, for mining is going to lead to development opportunities. And somehow there is an expectation that this will happen automatically. And we know that this does not happen automatically. It is clear that the government needs to do a number of things in relation to that. They need to have a very clear vision in terms of, what it is that they want to achieve, but also know what they actually need to put in place as programs to make this kind of positive contribution to development, socioeconomic development happen into their countries. They cannot leave everything to the mining companies. I mean, that is very clear. And I think Kelly already mentioned that as well. There are limits to what actually the mining company can do. So it is for the government to put in place definitely, the vision of what they want to achieve with this new investment coming in, if it's about foreign direct investment, new project, mining projects coming in, but then also what is needed in terms of the support measures. And then I think as ILO, when we come into these discussions, of course, we are there to support the governments, in formulating this kind of vision when it comes to creating more and better jobs through these new projects, what is needed in terms of skills development, what is needed in kind of programs that allow matching with local enterprises so that you have a broader based economic development around mining communities. And at the same time, we also work with the mining companies. And what we've, of course, as part of then what we see responsible business conduct, and we talked already about social license to operate. So how do you actually, as a mining company, really contribute? Not just by, I would say, looking at, okay, what are the assessments that you need to do and just take the minimalistic approach, but indeed looking at how you can come into that. And then what we do as ILO very often is stimulate those exchanges, those consultations between government and what we then call social partners, which are the local organizations of employers and the trade unions in that regard, and also the mining companies themselves. And we've been pulled in a few times when there were exactly these social conflicts. And the social conflicts can be related, either because of the working conditions in the mines or the kind of contracts that are being given, or because of the lack of actually being embedded into the local economy of the mining communities. And that is linked to what Todd and Kelly was saying as well, the huge expectations that actually exist within the communities, that all of this is going to happen. The jobs will be created. So that is actually what we do. It's not an easy conversation, but I think it's only by bringing all of the partners together that you can have the open discussion that Todd also was talking about, and then actually come to realizing that basically there are complementary, I would say, responsibilities, but they are distinct in what the government should be doing and what the mining company should be doing. They are distinct, and you cannot expect one to do the role of the other. And even consultations with local communities, and I would say local communities, it's also the government that actually needs to facilitate really those consultations with the local communities, and especially if it is, for example, with indigenous populations. We know there is a whole, that's still a different discussion maybe, but everything in relation to consultations with indigenous populations, the ILO, we have our Convention 169 on indigenous populations that have been ratified by quite a number of member states of the ILO, and they are still struggling to even set up these kind of more structured consultation processes. And we receive requests also from mining companies saying, we want to do those consultations, but if the government doesn't put in place those kind of formal and structured consultation processes, we in a way just need to figure out, with whom to have those consultations. And even when it comes to, and I will finish on that, but even when it comes to, knowing about what the communities want, I think it is still, yes, you can ask communities what you want, but if they say we want, and I'm going to give now, maybe an example that we've seen in the past. If they say, oh, we want a local football club, or we want you to sponsor our local football club. I mean, how in the end is that actually going to contribute to inclusive growth, and that actually should be triggered by these increased mining activities? So I think it's also a little bit, it does need a more strategic thinking about all of this, and not just like immediate nice things to have, but how do you really contribute to inclusive growth?
Thanks so much, Gita. And I really feel like with these conversations, this is the beginning of the honest reflection, and I don't expect full answers as much as I'd love them, but just for the sake of really digging in, just to follow, to reflect two things that you said that I think are important to recognize, that this point about the expectation that governments should deliver services, the reality is that they don't, and they haven't. And I think that there are two very different reasons for that. Sometimes the capital is just not incentivized to extend the services to some of these remote communities, and that's not their interest. And sometimes it's that it's really hard, actually, and very expensive to extend public service delivery to these communities. And actually, Todd, in many cases, even when the government gets a significant, or is supposed to get a significant portion of the revenues, those are delayed, or they're not as high as is expected. And so the governments are actually still quite impoverished, and therefore it's difficult to extend these services. So in light of this real tension, to my mind, I feel like we should really grapple with that, because to me, it doesn't feel satisfactory to hand wave about this reality. And then I see a question in the wonderful, by the way, questions and answers that I hope we get to, but just a question about, I like this question that Matthew asked about whether the point should be to, because a couple of you have raised it about managing expectations, whether the point should be to be honest about what can be delivered and then actually deliver that. But I also wonder whether if the mining companies were more honest about the limits of what they could be offered, would the mining sector enjoy the access that it expects or wants, if the proposition to the community were, yeah, we're not going to be able to actually deliver that much, but we will try to minimize our impacts. Is that satisfactory, or do we have to do better than just manage and meet expectations, but actually figure out a way to ensure real meaningful benefits to the communities that are most impacted? So maybe
Well, I think it's not, Lisa, I think it's not just framing it as we've shown up and we're actually being honest, we're not going to deliver you anything. It's not that. It's here is what we can deliver. And if there is a more honest general discussion about that at the front end, and I think participants on the panel are, part of delivering that, then it will also manage expectations locally, because it's not that there are no benefits to the state, no benefits to local communities. Kelly's discussed some examples at the beginning of the session. It's more a question of having, as we've been saying for a long time, a kind of adult conversation about what is it possible to deliver, and not start with an expectation that, you know what, it's just going to be crap, but you need to do it anyway because we need your minerals. I don't think that is the framing that is being sought. Kelly, you wanted
I
to
don't
say
think that's
something?
the framing,
Kelly?
but I do want to
Kelly?
start. I do think it's important to recognize. I mean, Kelly's examples of the
Yeah.
positive work is very helpful, but the reality is that by far, communities have not seen real benefits, and so
Kelly,
the
you
point
wanted to
is
jump in though?
Could I, I mean,
Yeah,
just,
please,
could
please,
I just
Gita.
maybe just, I don't know whether that question was still addressed to me or not, Lisa,
Yeah,
but
no, Gita, please,
I mean, I
please.
think in terms of capacities of the government, or, how come there are no immediate benefits for the local communities, let's put it like this. I think you mentioned both elements, sometimes, I mean, is it about political will? Is it just about lack of capacity to actually do it? And I think that will depend very much on the country. And when you are dealing with an LDC country that, has very few resources, has a high degree of informality. I mean, the government does not have a lot of, tax revenues or so that is just, I think, a reality. And then it's a question of what do you prioritize? And I mean, that is, if they need to already invest in skills development programs, it's a kind, or maybe defense, who knows? I mean, there are so many different competing priorities. So that is one thing. Then the other thing, I think it's also important, what is actually in the investment contract, which is something that the mining company legally has committed to. We've heard from many governments that, first of all, in the negotiations, of course, there is an imbalance from time to time. But let's say that certain elements are included into the investment agreement in terms of skills development, the fact of hiring local staff, which actually means you need to train local staff as well. And then after 5 years, the international staff needs to leave and so on. But then who is following up actually on those commitments? There we also see that is actually not happening. And we had, I mean, very concrete examples, even within the countries, where at the one hand you have the Ministry of Labor that is actually responsible for handing out the work permits of the internationals. Whereas, of course, the agreements with the mining companies are primarily done by the Ministry of Mines, but they are not following up actually on this. So you see, there are internally, even within the government, there are sometimes these tensions or different interests, let's put it sometimes, in terms of what is it that you want to do. And then the other element is actually very often the incentives that are being given, you know, in the investment contracts, if I may say, there are many incentives that are being given, and then at the same time, the government is then expecting through what used to be called CSR, you know, that then the companies will automatically start behaving in a responsible way. But it's very difficult when you give things away to then expect that voluntary things will happen. And maybe that was a topic of previous speakers, but I think that is the other, you know, because governments, they want to attract the investment, and they're also in our work on foreign direct investment and how that should contribute to decent work and inclusive growth. You know, what are the indicators? You mentioned, how do you measure this? So we work with these indicators. So yeah, there are many different, I think, elements that should be looked at when it comes to that. Yeah, but open discussions and exchanges is the most important, and with all the actors who are basically have an interest in all of this, in making it happen in a positive way. Over.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Gita. I think one thing that was discussed earlier, not the point that you're making, which is an important one, but one thing that was discussed is that those who negotiate this agreement, where so many of these terms are agreed, are not the communities. And as you said, but I don't think we actually did address explicitly earlier, the terms are negotiated at a time that the government wants the investment and the company wants the concession. And so certain things may be agreed that in practice become very difficult, whether to monitor or to, you know, in the case of employment, for instance, what we've seen repeatedly are commitments to certain types of local procurement or local employment, but the provision will say, you know, as long as basically those skills are available in the local economy, and if they're not, then, or if the goods can't be procured at the same quality as, you know, foreign goods, then the company reserves the right to secure foreign goods, and then that's what ultimately happens because they're not available locally. So yeah, so I think what we have addressed in the past sessions is that relying on what's in the contract is not sufficient for really considering how these agreements will play out, and particularly with respect to local benefits. Maybe, Alan, to bring you into the conversation, and then we can open it up for full discussion. But maybe from particularly the transactional side and how you see it from company side, I think, first of all, building on this question of, you know, that I also think that there's a tension between that has come up in this discussion about that companies and their financiers often approach these issues in a risk management and a compliance sense. So what are the obligations that companies must meet, either through the terms of the agreement or for a social license to operate or otherwise? And it's true that there are real risks of not delivering, and risks of project delays, and risks of liability for environmental harms and so on. But that's quite a different framing from an approach that to maximize the benefits locally. So I just wonder if you can speak from your experience about you know, the approach that you've seen, and whether you see a tension between those two approaches, and how you would navigate that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you very much. And thanks, by the way, for letting me join this conversation, because I think all of the comments so far are really just, you know, spot on and touch, I think, very well on the tip of some very complicated issues and how they fit together. You mentioned tensions, and I think in looking at risk management, and how companies, to say nothing of the impacted communities and investors and governments, can navigate that. It strikes me, going back to some of the points that have already been made, what we're talking about is covering gaps. So you mentioned attention. I'll give you an example. This building of trust and honesty, which is so critically important, is a gap between what people say or maybe intend on the one hand and what they actually do. And if you overpromise, that creates one level of gap between, for example, expectations and reality. Another one, though, is saying you're doing something and you're actually not, which can have knock-on effects if you're talking about risk management, not just downstream to impacted communities where the mining project is located, but also upstream, if you will, from a financial standpoint, to investors. So look, for example, at the enforcement action in the United States by the SEC, related not to a project in the US, but to a project with a dam failure in Brazil. And Vale had made statements in the concern to the SEC, not in documents that were filed in the United States, not in securities disclosures, but in ESG reports and sustainability reports about how they were meeting international standards with their mine, in particular with their dams. And when they had a catastrophic dam failure, causing significant harm both to people and to the environment, that gap between what they had said they were doing and what they actually were doing caused not just the physical impacts in the local area, but also, ultimately impacts financially and more importantly, reputationally. People talk about reputational risk. I don't think that you can't really divorce that from the substance of what you're actually doing and what you're actually saying. It's actually the shadow of that. It is not itself the issue. So that kind of gets to how these things can be interrelated and correlated. Another gap we've talked about is between government capacity and the capacity limited of mining companies to address some of that. There are direct impacts, for example, making sure that the labor force is properly compensated, given the local context, making sure that the conditions under which they're working are not unduly dangerous, making sure that there's access. Um, and if you do those things right, then the negative impacts of mining operations in the very local community will be less. Your local procurement, the local healthcare that's being provided, the need for that healthcare, right? Those things will all be better. Um, Having said that, I think we see it in the Q&A, there is a gap between those, and Todd mentioned it as well, between those who benefit, maybe directly, and those who don't, and they're impacted by the mining operations adversely. For example, mine workers may get paid, they may get access to healthcare, their families may as well, but others in the community may only suffer, for example, adverse health impacts from some of the environmental consequences of the mining operation, air quality or water quality or what have you. And that may be disproportionate. It may spread out in a wider area. That's, and again, a gap between who benefits and who doesn't. The last one I'd say, and it gets to your earlier question, is I think it's useful to make a distinction, two distinctions. One between benefits and harms, and the benefits in particular we focused on, or the lack of them, and mitigants for harm, because those aren't the same thing. And from a risk management, from frankly, a business operations standpoint, the benefits that you provide to stakeholders, whether they're employees or affected communities or host governments, uh, can be very real. The harm that might be associated with a mining operation or any other kind of a large process technology or extractive industry, that harm can be longer lasting. It can be more widely felt. It can be less transparent up front. And there may be differences both in timing and in space as far as who's affected by that. So what you promise to do to mitigate that harm is not driven only by the investment agreement and compliance with laws. It's not driven only by compliance with stricter, perhaps international standards that may apply, including if you have debt financing, for example, equator principles that banks may be using. Uh, it is also driven by a desire to, I think, close again that credibility gap and make sure that the trust that you're trying to engender is in fact worthwhile. The last piece I think that's worth distinguishing, if you look at benchmarks and how you measure it, a lot of what we talk about with trust and risk management is qualitative, not really quantitative, but it's still important. And just because you can't measure it with some formula, that doesn't mean you shouldn't bother. There are other things with environmental impacts where there are steps being taken to try to find other ways to quantify the actual impacts. I'll give you an example. At the beginning, you asked about projects that might have a net benefit. I want to start with a project, and it raises the controversial issue, I think, of natural capital accounting. In Western Australia, BHP had a mineral sands mining project that I would call subjectively a failure. It did not do what it was supposed to do. It didn't last very long. It did have adverse environmental impacts for sure, certainly on water quality, and it closed early. And they've used it as a pilot project for restoration, for rehabilitation, especially of damaged water habitats, and maybe even potentially from regenerative techniques that could be adopted in partnership with some, not all, but some members of the local community, with NGOs, with local universities in Western Australia, with the idea of showing that there's an economic or at least quantifiable economic value to those sorts of natural practices that under a natural capital accounting mechanism could be used as a way to benchmark the impacts they're having so that they can leave the area at least as good, if not better, than how they found it. And the jury's out as to long term whether that kind of a thing could actually work and whether it will make sense in any other places. But I do think that those are differences. So that gets to the gap between mining the operations period and the legacy of what happens after the mine is decommissioned when the benefits are less apparent.
That's really helpful, Alan. I like your point about accounting that shows that you're at least better. And I see a couple of the questions in the Q&A, and then want to open it up for discussion among you. But at least a couple of questions in the Q&A that point to the same question, which I think which I hadn't even thought of, but think that we should ask, which is why can't companies do more for communities under this circumstance? Even if governments should be doing more, even if it feels like you're managing the expectations or meeting the expectations of what the community wants, why can't companies do more? Todd, it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, I think the first answer is if we think the model's not working, just putting more money to it doesn't solve the problem, right? So, why put more money into a problem that, where we don't have a solution is, I think, the first thing. And I think the second thing is going to the sort of some of the comments and to your question, Lisa, it's like I've worked at a number of mining companies who put in huge amounts. In Papua New Guinea, the Ok Tedi mine provides for the second best hospital in the whole country, funds the whole thing, right? And because of that, a number of things have happened. The health of the immediate community improved. 20,000 people from neighboring communities turned up and now live in sort of aluminium huts around the community because they can also access the healthcare. And when the mine shuts, that all goes away because the government don't have the skills nor the money to keep it going, right? So it's just one example of here's a mining company doing more, providing like top tier healthcare, better healthcare than other parts of that country get, and it's an attractant to a broader population. Then the local population don't like the people who've come in because they cause problems themselves. They're squeezing them out of the health services. They're causing potentially problems of violence and congestion. They're also starting to take their jobs. So the alternative is to say, we could give $10 million a year to the national government or the federal government to run a hospital system or to run the hospital. And it's nowhere. That's what happened in Panama. And the government just didn't spend the money well, right? So I don't know we've got the answer to the problem, which is before you start throwing more money at it, because I'm not sure throwing more money at it solves the problem. In fact, it might accentuate the problems we've got.
Yeah, I
That's
think some
great.
of that too comes down to this, how are royalties, for example, being used? So if a national government typically is collecting royalties from the mining operation, are those used to close deficits in current operating budgets for the government? Are they used to reinvest in infrastructure or education, maybe healthcare? Are they set aside in a rainy day fund so that you have long-term sovereign wealth essentially that's available for future economic development? Are they going into pockets of people, illegally in ways that might be corrupt? I mean, there are really different models for this, and I think looking at the economic development aspect and not just the sustainability piece, but why are mines located where they are? Well, obviously that's where the resources are. But if you have resources in multiple parts of the world, why do mines tend to be in countries that have weaker controls over some of these things and perhaps less economic or political power to deal with some of the challenges that are associated with that. That's one of the reasons why, for example, organizations like ETAs exist, is in order to try to ameliorate some of those imbalances and get a better deal for most people, most places. But I think that's a really challenging question, and it's not unique to the mining sector. I do think, though, the mining sector becomes more important because, in the last half century, we have extracted more materials from the earth than in all of human history prior to that point. And with the expansion you mentioned at the top, Lisa, of digital economies, of the electrification of mobility, which require battery metals, of so many ways that we depend now on perhaps a wider range of materials. We'll go beyond lithium and cobalt. We're certainly moving beyond iron and steel and tin and nickel. There are things that we're going to need as we shift from basically liquid fossil fuels or solid coal and move into other materials which are going to be essential to our economy. That scale of that transition, even if we continue using the fossil fuels, but that additional mining activity is going to be impacting more places, and not just in emerging markets. There are issues around, for example, developing new mines in the United States and in Europe, where some of these same issues, are playing out. And that's in places with high government capacity and more formal economies.
Can I make a comment in here? There's been so many fantastic, I don't even know where to start. We could probably talk for hours on this. I'm going to pull it right back to the way I tend, because I'm a lawyer by training, and when I sit in conversations with a bunch of technical people, I really have to kind of say, okay, I got to bring this back to something I can understand, which is really fairly low level. For me, a lot of it is about values. And when you are a mining company and you're associated and part of a mining company, what is the value? What is the culture of that company? And do you want to be part of that? And when you look at the younger generations, increasingly, that they question that. Do I want to be part of that? So the organization itself has to have a culture of strong commitment to a set of values that you're going to take into these negotiations with government, that you're going to take into your relationships with the community. And I like to make the point that we are part of the community. It's not the community and the company. We're part of the community. We're neighbors over the back fence. And so, one example is that where we can have influence is being committed to our values and bringing in practices that might not be legislatively or legally required in that country. We work in Ecuador, and there is the whole environmental process. The social process is not as developed, and we have been long associated with EBRD. As a very, very small company, when we first bought Chelopech, we needed funding. EBRD came in and said, sure, we'll give it to you, but you got to raise your bar like way up here. It was very fortunate for us. It was a huge struggle, but it laid a foundation for values that we have. And when we go into Ecuador, for example, not legally required, but we said it's required because this is who we are. This is what we're committed to. We're working with the government to try and help develop those processes. It's pretty much, in my view, fundamental value systems and what you choose to believe in and live to. Again, promise, but you have to deliver. It's the reputation, it's the trust. Relationships in these areas grow and develop over years, and they're destroyed in a second. So if you want a long-term sustainable business, you have to deliver. You have to continue to deliver. It is difficult to negotiate, and you're getting your permits from the national government, but you're living next door to the people who are immigrating to the US because there's no jobs there, who need the healthcare, who need the technical skills development that will help them sustain livelihood when the mine inevitably closes. That is a reality we have to face. And we have to have those conversations and engagements, not just from our, and I'm in Canada, Canadian ethnic, myopic view. We have to learn to talk and engage and understand each other. And that is each other. It is, I think this is not just the mining company's accountability. It's obviously the government's accountability. It's our desire that the communities have a strong voice. We have to think about how do we help them have that voice. So, and then not be offended when they exercise it, not be offended when they come in and say, well, now that I understand this better, this is actually what I want to put forward. Okay. It's like when my kids, they say, well, I want this. And I'm like, but weren't you just 8 yesterday? No, apparently not. It's a little, maybe that's just basic, but I sometimes just think, figure out who you're associated with. If you can't be proud of that, if you can't live to that value system, you're in the wrong place doing the wrong work.
Yeah, to Kelly's foundational point there, value and values absolutely are aligned. They're not in conflict in most of these situations. And the reason for that is these are not transactions. And I say that coming from a transactional background. They're relationships. They're long-term relationships, and that's an important thing. So if you're talking to other community members, to use that language, whether they're in the local community or the governments or employees or others, there has to be that give and take, and things will change over time. And it's irrational to expect other people to give you flexibility and to be trustworthy if you aren't yourself doing that as well.
If I can come in on what Kelly is saying, in terms of be, true to values, and I think that is also what in the work of the ILO on responsible business conduct, that is actually why we see the private sector as such and companies as such important, allies actually in our work in terms of promoting those international labor standards, upholding those in their operations, even when operating in countries where the legislation may not be, at that point. So I think what Kelly is also saying is, as a company, you have a positive role really to play in if you have globally certain values and principles that you commit to. And it goes back to your also, Alan, your points of, reputational risk. And, we see, of course, a lot of legislations happening now on due diligence, on transparency, corporate reporting. Kelly, you in Canada, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of all of the legislations, the Canadian ombudsperson for responsible business conduct looking at, or potentially looking at grievances, including, from mining communities, of course, outside of Canada and so on. So we see that this whole responsible business conduct agenda is also taking off, at least in certain parts of the world. Let's put it like this. And I think also our engagement as ILO with organizations like ICMM, that also try to at least have a number of mining companies move into the same direction of upholding certain principles in the operations in whatever country that they may be operating, where we know the legal systems are different, the capacity of the government is different in terms of living up to certain obligations and so on. But of course, it needs to, again, and I think that's another point, how do you actually, as a whole sector, move into that? And because that is also, we see different practices, of course. I mean, that is one thing. You can have your principles, but then in practice, what is actually happening? And I think there also we can say there's often, in the same way as governments, they make certain commitments, but actually what happens in practice, the same with companies. You see very high principles, but then what happens sometimes in practice may be different as well. But also it's not that the whole sector is already on that path, if I may say, towards sustainability. So even within a country, you see companies operating in a different way. So when we did these roundtables with all of the mining companies, different ministries, local communities, national employers organizations, trade unions, we really got so different experiences actually coming back. And everyone is operating in the same country. So that is another area, I think, how the sector as a whole, and how you have lead firms in that regard who are, really having these values, having these principles, implementing them in as far as they can, even in challenging circumstances. And how can they be really leading the sector in this regard, especially in the context, I would say, of as you were mentioning, the increase of mining activities that are taking place already and that will happen in the next years. So how can that really become an opportunity instead of just continuing, to Lisa's point, in terms of maybe not having those good examples to show for. So how do you bring the whole sector? What is the role of companies like Kelly's and others, in moving into that direction as well?
Can I just quickly add, I couldn't agree more with Kelly's point about the importance of culture in addressing some of these things. When you are on a mine site, you're living there. You make friends with the people who live in the local communities. They are your community. It's not like you're entirely separated, and you want to be a good neighbor. And in the environment where you have international obligations or obligations of an ISHA or corporate level obligations, so much doesn't come through to the level on the ground and relies on individuals on the ground making judgment calls about what's the right thing to do. And if the culture of the company leans towards, whether it be honesty, enabling the local communities, being fair, these types of cultural characteristics of the company become super important to the 1,000 things that happen beneath the requirements of the international obligations and the ISHA themselves.
Mm.
Can I just
think that's a great point because and so it's culture, but we have to recognize we're all human beings and we respond to carrots and sticks. So, internally in the company, how are your incentives structured? What are the carrots and what are the sticks? And to make sure that you are incentivizing a culture and living a culture that's toned from the top, that does filter down, that you are creating accountability. That we have some independent advisory boards where for different issues that that we manage, common to all mining companies, they actually report to the board. They work with our management, but they report into our board. So there's that accountability cycle where they have an unfiltered views. And if you want and desire a culture, the team that's responsible for that, the executive team, the leader, senior management team, you got to go. You have to go and see, how is this actually working? We talk to the communities. We bring our board and our senior management team, and we sit down with community members and we talk to them. So there is a trust and verify element to that as well, because you can't have, sort of, as Todd says, if you've got a whole layer that's not living the culture and the values that you think you're creating, well, you haven't checked. And then you again have the issues. And if you've got issues with the government, and it's potentially, well, we've got a way that we can make that permitting process a little bit faster for you. It'll only cost you this much. You have to know the culture of the integrity of the organization is going to respond in a way that says, I'm sorry, we are a Canadian mining company. We're not allowed to do that. Let's have a discussion about how to progress apart from that. Very difficult all across the way. And, one of the elements, and I think it's been brought up here, is that you're dealing with interests at so many different levels that those interests often conflict. And as Todd mentioned earlier, even at the community level, the interests can conflict. So just having some structure and incentives to unpack that and sort it. You're not going to solve all of them, and you're going to have some people, some organizations not happy with the end result. All right, well, how do you continue to have the conversation so that you at least hear it, you understand where the tensions are arising? The incentives through the debt and equity markets. Unfortunately, we're in a little bit of a, I hope, temporary phase where some of that spotlight is drifting. I hope that doesn't, and I believe that that's not going to be the case. I believe that in the longer term, again, coming down to values, we're going to have it be where it needs to be. The whole environment needs incentives and some sticks and values to continue to live and create value for the whole, not just the parts. The sum of the parts has to be greater than each piece individually added up.
Can I just, for the sake really of the rigorous discussion that we are trying to have here, try to shift us back a bit from what good looks like to why we haven't seen good in the past. Because I would say that a lot of the companies that have seen really tragic social or environmental outcomes or have faced major protests would say that they have values. And I think, Todd, you've been in part of these contexts where there are local protests, and it's not for a lack of a person like you who really cares about the community. It's just been very hard. So because I just want to be recognized that for 20 years, I've been part of panels and discussions where we have this conversation around needing to manage expectations and having good values and all of these things and going beyond compliance. And the reality is that we still face real challenges and protests and so on. And so I just want to get back to why it has been so hard in practice, and why is what we're, if this were as easy as really practicing one's values, why are the results not what one would expect? Yeah, Todd, I see you've unmuted.
Like everybody else, I could talk for hours on this stuff. The short answer is because it's really, really difficult. And let me give you a single example in terms of community benefits. In the mine in Panama, it's one of the biggest mines built in the world this century. The indigenous population there moved there only about 10 years before the mine started construction. There was a non-indigenous community who'd been living in the area for, I don't know, hundreds of years. But under the IFC principles, the indigenous population who'd moved from the north of the country to the mine, to where the pit was, were all relocated and housed. So they got new houses, solar power, running water, etc. The resentment that built up with the campesinos, the farmers and their families who'd been there for 300, 400 years was very, very difficult to overcome. So the question is, well, how does a mining company solve for this? Mining company trying to do the right thing, applying all the right principles for the indigenous relocation. has stepped in the middle of like a community tension that is very, very hard to solve. You can't build new houses for the 3,000 families of the small town community there. So I could give you example after example after example of things like that. So it doesn't answer your question of like, what have you got to do differently? But it goes, I think, to the question to say, this is really hard. Understand that folks are trying, that there are a lot of well-meaning, skilled people trying really hard on this stuff. And also that, the cultures of places and the history of these places plays a role that is bigger than the mine itself. In Papua New Guinea, the way people deal with disputes is through violence. We by creating a mine, we attracted people, creating a mine and the services that a mine created, we attracted a whole heap of people from literally hundreds of different tribes who then solved their problems through violence in the town. And so that's trying to unpack that is trying to unpack thousands of years of cultural history in Papua New Guinea. So that's not a satisfying answer, I suppose, Lisa, but it's like, this is very, very hard to do. And maybe there's not there's definitely not a simple answer. And maybe other folks have sort of new ways of thinking about it.
But if I can just jump in on the issue, or Alan mentioned value and values kind of go together. And going back to one of the things that was out of the genesis of the discussion, this whole series with Lisa and me, was why are there recurrent conflicts in this particular sector, and what are some of the kind of honest conversations that we had about? I think the point is that from what I can see from the mining company's perspective, is they don't want to end up in disputes, and they recognize the importance of, both from their own values for, companies that are well run, as Kelly's providing an example, and from the point of view of generating value in the project. So it's not, I don't think, if a company really wants to benefit, then they have to, really sophisticate, in a really sophisticated way, engage with precisely the issues we've been discussing. And one of the things seems to be, entering into a kind of realistic discussion at the front end about what can we deliver, and as was said at the beginning, what do you really want, what do you really need, and what is possible? And something positive can come from that, I think, for all involved.
I think, Christoph, if I can clarify, I
Go
wasn't
ahead.
saying, I'm sorry, Kelly.
No, go ahead.
I wasn't saying that the value and values are automatically aligned. I'm saying they can be aligned.
Yeah.
They can
Yeah.
also, let's to Lisa's question, I think let me put on a different hat for a moment. Money. If you're a mining company and people are asking you for things that are going to cost you money, there's a cost benefit analysis to be done. Well, do I need to comply? That's minimum. Do I need to because it engenders other benefits and other loyalties? Do I need to because it's the right thing to do? And how am I going to pay for it? Fundamentally, most of what's coming out of the ground is volatile in terms of its value. And the timing of when you take it out and can sell it or process it matters a great deal with business cycles and commodity cycles. And those price cycles being very erratic make it difficult to take on fixed costs that are not variable with mining operations, whether they're for economic benefits or anything else. Royalties may be happily correlated, but a lot of the things that you're paying into a particular local community might not be. And so I do think that looking at this in the economic picture and looking at how it correlates to the capital stack for the project, a lot of those, and who decides, a lot of those things matter. And I give you an example of some projects I worked on that one many years ago when I was just starting out. It was not a mining project directly. It was a smelter project, aluminum smelter in Ghana, powered by a very large hydroelectric dam that had been planned for decades and finally was built. US Exim played a very big role. Remember, this is the Cold War initially when that was rolling out. And eventually the project was underpaying its workers significantly, and there was a strike, and they had to triple the wages. And the idea was to develop upstream a bauxite mining industry in Ghana that would be justified by the smelter using the cheap hydroelectric power, which was supposed to have benefited the local economy, but really didn't because it was focusing on the smelter operations, and not need to bring in imported alumina and develop the economy more broadly. The economics around Kaiser Aluminum's and Valco's decision were, I think, clouded by some short-term thinking, and eventually they exited, and and some things closed and some things stayed and some things moved on, and changed. But I think that whole kind of sad episode was partly a result of short-term thinking on the economics and not long-term, but also to Todd's point, context and the role of the government in that was, cannot be ignored, because some of the mistakes were made because the government wanted them to be made. Not they didn't want mistakes, but what they wanted ended up being a mistake.
I think you've sort of touched on, Todd, one of the really tough parameters of this whole issue, which is what frame of reference are the various parties using? Because that informs often, the priorities and the interests and so on. But are you taking a long-term frame of reference, or are you short-term? Are you a government that's only looking to the next election cycle, and what do I need to do to get the votes? Because, that often, ends up disadvantaging the communities where there's 2,000 votes versus, if I've got a lot of money from the mining company and I can benefit the national capital and I can do all this. And I actually feel mining companies need to really stick to that long-term way of thinking, trying not to react to the quarter-on-quarter investor cycle and, reporting cycle, and really invest in what is the long-term benefit, and looking across financial capital, but the other stakeholder values, measures of capital. You talked about natural capital, social capital, trying to take a view of value that is broad. There's no getting around the fact, though, it's a capital intensive industry. If you do not have access to financial capital, you're not going to do anything if you can't generate returns. But trying to think about value across a broader spectrum. It does require, though, all of the players. I mean, it's the mining companies can lead, and I think we should. I think we've got capacity. I think we can help educate government stakeholders. We can work with NGOs. We can work with academia. We've engaged with NGOs and brought them to our sites where they were, publishing articles that were making, creating some issues, or not creating issues, but raising issues. We invited them to come to our site, walk around with us. I think we have to be open to the feedback, though. We have to know, I'm not perfect. What are you seeing that I might not be seeing that I could do better? And bringing academics, people from universities in, again, to see and offer opinions and thoughts. But, taking that longer term perspective and trying to figure out a way to manage that political issue that arises potentially when it's a shorter term perspective, create capacity in governments, create capacity in our supply chain. We work with our supply chain to help develop capacity as well on the GHG emission side, climate change, the scope 3s, because the measuring of all of that, trying to help drive that. We can be a very, very impactful partner. We can't be the only player with all the answers. That's not how relationships work.
Kelly, I cannot believe how fast time flies. And so with just a very few minutes, let me ask a big question, actually, which is, we've talked a lot about community relations. I don't think we've resolved the issues. Actually, we've recognized how difficult, and actually that we should be more honest about those difficulties, because the proposition remains quite different from the realities. So I hope this is the start of that real critical reflection. It's not an issue of not telling the good story. It's really an issue of not being able to deliver on the story that's being told. But the big question I want to ask, with so few questions remaining, is more on the environmental side, because Dundee and Newmont and many of these companies have had local judicial processes stop mining projects because of concerns about environmental damage. And the response of the community of the companies is almost always to persist, and to try to overturn in some way those concerns, whether directly or through ISDS and so on. So maybe with just a few minutes left, what about these situations in which the local courts, and Todd, we've obviously talked about the Panama case also, in which the local courts or other judicial or administrative bodies have actually found against or have stopped projects or have found that projects are not complying with environmental requirements. And the response of the companies pretty consistently is not, oh, let me see how we can do better. It's to really challenge those findings. So maybe with just a few minutes remaining, maybe Kelly and Todd especially, if you have thoughts on those situations.
Sure, I do. I have a hard stop actually in a couple of minutes. So I'll just quickly speak to our Ada mine took 15 years to get into, through permitting, through consultation, through and get into production. It's in a Natura 2000 region, which is a protected site in Europe with some endangered species. Through the whole process and through sort of, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. The whole footprint of the mine was redesigned, made much smaller, utilizing an integrated mine waste facility so that it's sort of a combination of a tailings and waste in structure that is cell by cell as it fills, is continually rehabilitated. There was 2 species of endangered tortoises in the area, which we relocated for the duration of the mine life. And as we are going into closure, there's a whole program to relocate them back, monitoring all of that. So I think that the process can have results, and it doesn't mean you cannot develop the project.
Yeah.
It just
I want to give Todd a minute to respond. I mean, I think it's heartening. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's heartening to hear a response that, that in response to these concerns, the company is willing to adapt, because there are a lot of cases, including, I think, Dundee and other countries, where the response has not been to adapt. It's been to reject the court's ruling. So maybe Todd, I'm not asking either of you to represent, again, we hope you're here in your individual capacity and not to represent companies, but maybe Todd, if you can speak to
Sure.
how you see navigating that tension.
As quickly as I can. So I've worked at some of the really big mines. The cost of shutting down your mine in terms of revenues and roughly in the order of $10 million every day, right? So there are huge incentives to keep the machines turning. And that drives a whole heap of behaviors that people don't like, right? And sitting alongside that, and as we touched on this earlier on, but it's a really important part. Over time, what I've seen in a lot of the countries I've operated in is that the environmental regulator simply doesn't have the skills to prosecute the case or understand what's gone on, right? And oftentimes there's been, mistakes made, there's non-compliance, etc. But the company and the people outside the company and the communities don't trust and have lost confidence in the regulator. There's also a question of confidence in the legal system in some of these places. So that longer term cultural problem, so you've got this sort of pressure by the company, we've got to keep the machines turning, it's $10 million every day. Those guys in the regulator don't understand what they're doing, and the courts, well, they're questionable too, right? So that creates that sort of like, I suppose, a point where people say, oh, maybe they've got it wrong. And it allows that gap to say, well, let's just keep on pushing. my view is huge investment in capabilities in the environmental regulator, ongoing, not at the point at which you just get an approval for a mine. Ongoing is critically important to addressing that issue. Without that confidence, the mine always wins.
Thank you. So I wish we could, I genuinely hope this is the beginning of the discussion, because I think in this case too, in the environment case too, like the communities discussion, there's a question of, what should be objective standards too, in terms of what types of impacts are, should be tolerated or not. And the distrust and the lack of the ability of both governments and companies to manage all of the interests and the risks is really something to grapple with. So as with the prior sessions, this conversation, as you said, Todd, could go on for hours, but I really hope that this seeds, and it has for me, really critical reflections that should help us think as a sector, as a community, how to manage some of these tensions. So with that, let me thank you for the inspiration and the provocative comments, and really hope that we can continue the discussion in other fora. So thank you so much. I know Kelly had to drop on the hour. Alan, Todd, Geeta, Christoph, thank you so much, and to be continued.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for your
you.
contributions.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
The last of these sessions in June, and hopefully go on from there to further policy considerations. But it's been a really rich discussion, and thank you everyone taking part.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.